Hi, I'm Dr. Shiloh.
And I'm Dr. Scott.
And this is LA Not So Confidential, the forensic psychology and true crime podcast.
Each episode, we explore the intersection of psychology, the criminal justice system, and entertainment.
Today, our episode is on the forensic psych topic of false confessions versus true confessions. Welcome back. Hope you are enjoying this official beginning of summer.
Woo-hoo.
We are recording this on Memorial Day. I was going to say Memorial Day weekend, but like the weekend's almost over. So we are cruising right into summer. That means stay tuned for information on our walking tours with CLA in a Day. We are going to be announcing those dates that are going to be available pretty soon. As always, Patreon members will get first dibs. We keep these at small groups on purpose, maybe a dozen, maybe to 15 people per tour. So if you're local or if you're going to be coming in from out of town, your best bet is, even if you just join Patreon for a month, to be able to snag some spots. That's a tactic. We're not against it. Those will be coming up. It's going to be true crime walking tours through Los Angeles. We're probably going to do 2 different locations, one more in the Hollywood area, and maybe we'll go back downtown for the other. So we'll just have to see what our tour guide, Chris, can come up with for us. Very exciting as we move into summertime. So what's been going on? What are we doing lately?
Oh, both of us have been pretty busy, right? I've been on Bob Ruff shows, giving commentary on several different things going on, and then you're doing Bob Mott. We're covering the Bobs, right?
We're covering the Bobs. We got Bobs here and there. So yours is like professional, have a forensic psychologist on to talk about some things that are psychology. Like, I have just been popping on to Defense Diaries live streams during the Karen Reed trial because I'm basically like the 13th juror. No. Yeah, he's been live streaming the trial, and he and Allie have been offering some commentary. So my days off on Mondays, I've been trying to pop on for like an hour or so and watch along. And then, we do a little bit of chatting if there's something that comes up that is relevant to, any of our experience in the room. So
right.
That's been fun.
Well,
keeping up on it.
You were the gateway drug for me into the Karen Reed thing because it was sort of not on my radar. And now I don't know if I'd say obsessed. I'm sort of flabbergasted by the whole thing. There's just so much going on there. I mean, I'm not even saying that like the waters are muddied. I just think that there's a lot of obfuscation going on there by law enforcement. It seems like it seems like they're throwing a lot of things in the air.
It's very interesting. I mean, if we were still doing documentary reviews, I hadn't watched the Karen Reed one on purpose until this weekend. I started it, but I think it's just such an interesting tactic that her legal team kind of invited in a camera crew. She has said like this has been her way to sort of testify without testifying, which I mean just kind of speaks to like the day and age of how trials are tried, sort of in the courtroom and sort of by public opinion, and the content that is created around all that. I mean, we've talked about that before. Sometimes things are way too soon. And I don't know if that's a good choice or a bad choice on their part, but it was obviously strategic. So yeah. Anyway, that's anything else, like anything good that you've been watching lately?
Well, I mean, I've been pretty open about this with our Behind the Couch and Discord, but I had about 10 days off for a heart surgery. So I was watching, I took a break.
Yeah.
And I'm
guys.
fine. Everybody listening, Miracles of Modern Science. I had like this amazing, very quick surgery where, they go in through your femoral arteries to kind of fry a couple of cells. And I do feel a lot better. But I was watching a lot of classic horror movies because those are so relaxing, right?
Yeah. Those keep your heart nice and calm.
Although what I did pick up last weekend, and I hope to finish it this week, is a really great book on the hunt for Breonna Maitland that was given to me when we were in London last year. And I'm just now finally getting around to reading it. And I feel so badly because the author and I had a great conversation. He came over to our table and talked to us at length, and he gave us signed copies of the book. And I'm just now getting it. And I'm like, oh, wow, I need to give him a call. Really well written, because he's coming at it from a private detective standpoint, which is really great. So that's what I've been doing.
So we will move on after this, but I forgot to tell you there's so many rumors that the OA might be coming back for another season.
Oh, yeah. You texted me that.
Oh my God. We have to, like, I want to go back and rewatch the first 2 seasons.
Yeah, I got to go. I don't know if I got through the entire second season because I was just afraid, like, well, if they're not going to continue this, then I'm not. Because
I
now they canceled
know.
the Wheel of Time on Amazon.
Oh, did
Right
they?
as you get
People
sucked
love
into a
that.
show, it pisses me off.
Shoot. All right. Enough of that. Let's do a recap of our last episode and then we'll get into it.
On our last episode, we spoke with Michael Bayer, founder of True Case Films, and he's also the director behind the new 3-part true crime docuseries Vanished, the Heather Elvis case. Michael has a background in video production spanning over a decade, but what sets him apart is his time spent working inside a criminal defense law firm where he gained a deep understanding of the legal strategies and the psychological dynamics of the justice system. And in Vanished, he brings both of those worlds together. He uses his storytelling skills and legal insight to not only explore the haunting disappearance of Heather Elvis, but to also shed light on the powerful influence of social media in shaping public opinion as well as impacting real life investigations. It's a gripping series that also raises important questions about online behavior, misinformation, and the long road to justice. It also has some just absolutely startling twists in it. And
Right.
really, from a clinical psychologist, forensic psychologist perspective, there is some bizarre behavior in this documentary, and I highly recommend that you watch those 3 episodes. But if you haven't had a chance to listen to our interview with him, please check out episode 207 for more details.
Yes. So that brings us to episode 208 today. Big topic, a topic that has been covered a lot on other shows, especially just in terms of false confessions, wrongful convictions, something in a sense we haven't really dipped our toe into a whole lot. But today we want to keep this one pretty research focused as to stay away, I don't know, I guess from a lot of the lore and emotionality about false confessions that really has like swept the true crime world in recent years. So we are going to stick to what we know, and more importantly, what we don't know about this topic.
Right. We've got a lot of science that we'll be covering, which I think is fascinating, but this is an interesting field and area of study within our line of work, and I hope that there'll be even more studies that come along. But trigger warnings for today's episode, we're going to be talking about episodes of violence, cases regarding murder and assault, interrogation, intimidation, and emotional manipulation.
So in the United States, overturning a wrongful conviction, especially for high-level and serious crimes such as murder, well, it's a very long and complex and uphill process, and it's rarely a successful battle. For people already behind bars, the justice system is designed not to make reversals like this easy, especially when there's a recorded confession. From the West Memphis 3 to the Central Park 5 to endless cases around the world, false confessions have played a disturbing role in some of the most infamous and unjust wrongful convictions. We have Jesse Miskelly, a teenager with a low IQ who was pressured into confessing to a triple homicide in West Memphis, Arkansas. His story was riddled with inconsistencies and was unsupported by any physical evidence. His statement then implicated, of course, Jason Baldwin and Damien Echols, all of whom spent 18 years in prison before DNA evidence and public pressure led to their release.
In New York City, the Central Park 5 teenagers of color were coerced into confessing to a brutal attack on a jogger in 1989. They later recanted, and DNA even later identified the actual perpetrator. Their convictions were only vacated after they had already served time. John Purvis, a man with schizophrenia, was intimidated into confessing to a murder he didn't commit and was largely convicted on a statement made to his psychiatrist, leading him to spend 9 years in prison before the real killers were discovered. Also, Juan Rivera, under house arrest at the time of the crime he was accused of, was manipulated into giving a false confession to the murder of an 11-year-old victim, leading to 3 wrongful convictions despite exonerating DNA evidence.
And in Iceland's most notorious criminal case, 6 individuals were driven to confess to 2 murders that likely never occurred, following intense psychological coercion and abuse. Diagnosed with memory distrust syndrome, they were ultimately acquitted after decades of injustice. These cases reveal how easily the criminal justice system can be led astray when confessions, true or not, become the foundation of prosecution.
Mm.
And that memory distrust syndrome I just mentioned, we will definitely come back to that.
It seems like just synchronicity. There's a lot of talking about that right now in the air with several cases. The sad thing about this subject today is the reality is this happens way more often than people think. And according to the Innocence Project, which if you're not familiar with the Innocence Project, please go to their website. They are an amazing organization that does amazing work. And they have incredible databases and really, really solid statistical research. Nearly 1 in 3 DNA-based exonerations involved a false confession. That's over 28% of cases where somebody admitted to a crime they never committed. I think it boggles the mind for most people, even if you are a fan of this genre. Why would anyone admit guilt if they're innocent? And the reason is because the psychological, emotional, and situational pressures in police interrogations can absolutely lead to that outcome. To look at this from a larger perspective or a more holistic, well-rounded view, let's start with this sort of cosmic view. What urges us to tell the truth? We tell the truth for a variety of reasons, primarily to build trust, to foster strong relationships, and to maintain societal order. And that's not necessarily a conscious thing. It's built into us if we're raised pretty normally and we got great people to look up to as we are going through our developmental stages as children. Because when people trust us, they're more likely to believe what we say and rely on us. Honesty nourishes all types of relationships, whether they are with family, friends, or romantic partners.
Right. And truth telling is also seen as a moral imperative. It's something you feel like you have to do because it's the right thing to do. Like your conscience won't let you walk away from it. For example, if you see someone being bullied and you feel like you just can't stay silent, that urge to speak up or step in, that is a moral imperative in action. It's also a reflection of respect for others, and it treats them with dignity and shows that you value their perspective. Many believe that honesty is a moral principle that should be followed as it reflects a commitment to integrity. Truth-telling is essential for maintaining a functioning society as it allows people to navigate interactions and build trust in the system.
So in his article entitled The Frightful Prospect of Truth-Telling, writer Seth Slater responds to a previous article he had written on the subject of why people lie. And he explores why lying is such a common human behavior and why reactions to his first article were so significant. So even when we say we value honesty, why is lying so common? He points out that lying isn't just human. He notes that animals like gorillas, dolphins, and even birds can show deceptive behaviors, suggesting that lying may have evolutionary roots in how social creatures are able to navigate their environments. The point being is that to some extent, deception itself is a survival tool, not just a moral failing. Children begin experimenting with deception as early as 6 months old, with skills becoming more complex by age 4. So this developmental process suggests that lying is not learned from culture alone. It's something that we refine with practice, like any form of communication. Again, likely an adaptive survival value that works for us. In communication with readers about his previous article on lying, Slater notes that people share they are grappling with the emotional and ethical tension between being truthful and lying for convenience, for self-protection, or even for kindness.
It's so funny that you used birds as an example of lying, because my husband just showed me this video the other day where this magpie was injured, and it's like on a sidewalk next to a store somewhere.
I saw
Did
that.
you see it?
Yeah.
And so this injured bird gets fed by someone, and then the other birds come and they start sprawling out and pretending
with their beaks wide open.
Yes,
Yeah, they're like
pretending that they're
stumbling around.
dead. or like, I'm dying and like
Give me food.
flopping down, give me food. I was like, oh my God, this is so smart, but so manipulative.
Yeah, I remember there was a wonderful nature documentary that was showing an animal rescue that had a lot of orangutans, and they were getting their favorite treat of the day, which was oranges. And they would get in line and come in front, and then they would show, here's the best liar in the group, is that one would break out of line and get in line again and hide his two oranges behind his back in order to get another one. It's
Wow.
fascinating because it's just, again, another example of how little we actually know about brain function in animals. And it really is the final frontier for human consciousness as well, as far as us studying ourselves. So going back to Slater's article, while the saying that we all use, honesty is the best policy, holds a lot of cultural weight, honesty is definitely not always the best choice in every situation. And I think all of us can relate to that. Look, we weigh decisions based on context, on risk, and on personal stakes. And a lot of times we decide in the moment whether or not to lie or tell the truth. And there's discomfort around truth telling, especially when the truth is difficult. And sometimes it just leads people to lie as the easier route, even if they feel guilty afterwards. In essence, Slater is saying that truth and lies are often weighed sort of like a cost benefit analysis, and even white lies can have significant unintended consequences. So, big picture, why take the risk of lying? Because people lie for two main reasons. There's the thrill of seeing if they can get away with it, which feels very childlike. It also feels a little antisocial, right?
Yes.
But it also depends on the age and the overall functioning of an individual. And that can mean a lot of things, because a child's willful lie can be very different from the motivation of an adult's willful lie. Most likely, though, are what we call perceived benefits that can come as a result of the lying, like protecting themselves, looking good, avoiding conflict, or even sometimes helping someone else. And sometimes the potential payoff, like saving face or maintaining privacy, for that individual, it outweighs the potential damage that could be coming as a consequence. Additionally, if a lie, if it's believable and it goes undetected, that lie may actually elevate someone in the eyes of others. And in some cultures or contexts, that perceived effectiveness or confidence may actually matter more than truthfulness. I'll never forget in talking with my nephew, who is former Secret Service, and much like you and me, like a research whore, like just loves, going to trainings and getting all this information. And we were talking about our episode a couple of years ago about con artists.
Mm-hmm.
And he was sharing with me, one of their trainings was talking about why all of these overseas scam calls are so successful. Because people will say, well, how could these individuals in these other countries be so evil? They're stealing from old people.
Yeah.
And the way my nephew was taught, he said their experts came in and said their cultural view is very, very different. It's not my fault that you are falling for this. It's your fault for being stupid. Which is very different from our Western mindset, right? Or what we say, which is why if you do have that mindset of like, well, people should be good, then that can even like set you up for being more of a victim.
Wow, that's really interesting. And thank you for all of that foundation. For folks listening, if that sounded a bit familiar, we pulled some of that from our episode on pathological lying, which was episode 122. Seems like forever ago. So if you guys want more on that topic specifically, feel free to go back and listen. But getting back to today's, like looking at these differences between true and false confessions and the research behind it, really, I mean, with conversations with some other creators, we have been pretty inspired while guesting on those shows and kind of listening to other podcasts that were covering some really intense cases about false confessions being at the heart of that case. We've all listened to like amazing shows that have really, really dove deep into those. But for Scott and I, the way we work, we just simply wanted to see what the literature about the hallmarks of and the factors in true confessions and false confessions has to say, like what is out there. In reviewing the available research, we decided to break this up into a few differences. Just looking at it, it made sense to look at circumstantial differences, linguistic differences, and behavioral differences. So this really is kind of the meat and potatoes of the episode that we're getting into already. So we're going to do that, and then we're going to move into false confession specific research, and then look at evidence-based interrogations. To kick us off here, we were able to find a paper from March of 2019 in the Frontiers of Psychiatry journal titled Confessions and Denials When Guilty and Innocent: Forensic Patients' Self-Reported Behavior During Police Interviews. Yes, titles are always very wordy, but we got to get it across in a title so someone can search it. Was your dissertation a mile-long title like mine was?
No.
No? Good. I love it. Nice and concise.
Yeah.
So this study used a forensic population out of Germany and explored their behaviors and circumstances during police interviews. And they were able to get these individuals to talk about experiences of being interviewed by the police when they were actually guilty of a crime, and then times when they had been questioned when they were actually innocent. Like maybe they were a person of interest because of their criminal backgrounds or kind of being in the area when the crime occurred, that sort of thing. Actually, of the entire population of the people that they interviewed, 2/3 of the sample actually had this exact experience. So they were able to garner a lot. So in terms of their findings with regard to circumstantial factors, they found that, quote, with respect to true confessions, so that's meaning someone who was actually guilty and confessing to it, the most commonly reported reason was that the evidence was strong. This suggests that strength of evidence is crucial for the decision to make a true confession. And this is once more in line with already existing empirical evidence, end quote.
So another paper that looks at some of the particular factors in true versus false confessions is an older one from 2011. Okay, I must be wearing pantaloons to think that 2011 is old, but it is. Oh my God.
I mean, in the research world.
In the research world, right? But it is from a leading arm of the American Psychological Association, the Journal of Psychology, Public Policy and Law. So the paper is titled Comparing True and False Confessions Among Persons with Serious Mental Illness. This is really important, folks, because we're going to be coming back to factors involved in false confessions and individuals with factors that impact their mental health is a very big part of this discussion. But the research starts right off essentially saying that what we found, there is way more research out there on false confessions than there is true confessions. And before we look at their main finding, I'm sure you're wondering what serious mental illness is, which we'll be calling SMI, means so that you can conceptualize this information. So serious mental illness, or SMI, is going to refer to one or more mental, behavioral, or emotional disorders that result in serious functional impairment, something that interferes with a major life activity, like being able to hold down a job. So this could be a disorder like schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, OCD, PTSD, even some personality disorders. When we say that about the ability to hold down a job, there's also a term called ADLs, activities of daily living. So activities of daily living would be, can someone consistently care about their environment around them, like take care of their apartment? Can they bathe? Can they feed themselves to the point that they're needed? So one step up from ADLs would be being able to hold down any kind of job. And we want to be really careful here, because I want you to understand that with the improvements in treatment and the improvements of medication, bipolar disorder does not always have to be a completely debilitating disorder. Neither does schizophrenia, neither does OCD, neither does PTSD, or any of the personality disorders. There's a lot more options out there, even with medication, even with treatment. There are some individuals that are likely going to be way more affected by adverse conditions when in the context of an interrogation. So, okay, in regards to the circumstances of the interrogation, researchers found, in comparison to true confessors, there were 4 main differences with false confessors. False confessors were questioned more times, they took longer to confess, they perceived the evidence against them to be weaker, and they reported significantly more external pressure and less internal pressure. So, in other words, true confessors, the people who were actually guilty, confessed earlier on in the questioning, and they were responding to internal pressures. Sort of what we were talking about earlier. Maybe it was that moral imperative, perhaps, or maybe it was an understanding of, I'm screwed. They've got all this evidence against me. So I'm just going to get this over with. That's very different from those that were false confessions.
Yes, we're starting to see a picture of what that was like for them. All right, so turning to linguistic differences in the research, we focused on a 2021 study out of the Wrongful Conviction Law Review, and that study was titled The Language of Criminal Confessions, a Corpus Analysis of Confessions Presumed True versus Proven False. So a corpus-based approach to a study means that essentially they just analyzed a large collection of language data to determine patterns and usage in that language. The authors are, from little known places like Oxford and John Jay and Hofstra University. Actually, the author from Hofstra is a professor of forensic linguistics. So, just some so-and-sos doing this.
These are
research.
The real deals. Yeah, these are absolutely the highest level of researchers and academic institutions.
So they looked at two sets of samples for comparison. The first were confessions that were presumed true. And then the second sample were those that were proved false. With the data they gathered, they found that focusing on personal pronouns, impersonal pronouns, and conjunctions used in these confessions were the most relevant. So here's what that means, and here's what they determined. For false confessions, there was a high frequency of usage of impersonal pronouns like one, you, or they. For instance, one should always be respectful. You can learn a lot from watching the news. They say you shouldn't eat red meat. Kind of that collective you or the collective they. That's the pronouns that they were using. While true confessors contained a significant high frequency of personal pronouns and conjunctions. So definitely more I, me, myself, or even you, they, him, her, but in regards to an actual specific person rather than the collective they or you. And then conjunctions being words that connect a couple of thoughts like and, but, because, although. So we're starting to see a difference here when they start running these like literally through a database, just kind of seeing what these patterns are. Lastly, another difference they found was that in true confessions, I was often followed by a lexical verb, which was less frequent in false confessions. So lexical verbs are just very like true kind of main verbs like run, eat, see. So a lot of very to the point statements without trying to distance themselves from the action when the confession was true. And I feel like I'm helping my 7th grader with her grammar homework right now, but I just want to make sure we're like all thinking about the same thing here. So after they analyzed this collection of confessions and identified these nuances, they were able to go back and take this data and see if the findings could accurately predict which statement was false and which statement was true. So they ran a couple different studies doing this. The first study they conducted correctly predicted if it was a true or false statement with 74% accuracy. And then their second study correctly predicted it 83% of the time. So very interesting, but they noted this is just the beginning. This is not a call to start like running confessions through their model for diagnostic purposes, and that certainly more research is needed in this area. There were also a couple of earlier studies that yielded very small tidbits of information as it comes down to linguistics. In 1998, which also was a million moons ago, Shuey looked at the false and true confession statements from 85 participants, and he found that false confessions possessed fewer adjectives than the true confessions. And then back in 2013, Vayar et al. Found no differences for verbs as indicators of deception. So just, no findings are findings still. That might sound silly to kind of report that. But again, very limited data in this area.
That's fascinating, though. And I disagree. I think that we actually should be running all of it through the database.
Like,
you don't take any action on it, but like the more you run it through, the more data you have. But the next part that we want to talk about is something that we can both Dr. Shiloh and I can get very passionate about, which is the idea of body language analysis. And folks, most of you who've listened to the show, you know where we stand in terms of this. The idea of body language analysis, body language experts for detecting deception. If you haven't had a chance to listen to episode 188 on this topic, feel free to go back and listen. We hash it out in great detail. But just to be thorough, we looked again for this specific angle, and there is no available data that has yet been identified about the behavioral characteristics of true confessors, a guilty person who told the truth about the crime in a confession. Now, that would be a cool dissertation project if anybody's out there.
Yes.
Like, grab that sucker up. So we thought we would take the opportunity to quickly highlight a hallmark study in this area to show how bad we humans are at observing someone's behavior during a confession and then making a determination about innocence or guilt. Back in 2005, Kassen, Meisner, and Norwick conducted a two-part study where they recruited male prison inmates for a pair of videotaped interviews. Each inmate was instructed to go ahead and give a full confession to the crime for which he was incarcerated. Then they were asked to come up with a false confession for a specific crime they did not actually commit. So, very interesting concept and a way to set up this study, right? The real study began when the researchers had observers watch 10 of these confessions, a mix of both the true and the false confessions. And they found that neither college students nor police investigators had any statistically significant levels of accuracy. But what was apparent? The investigators were more confident in their judgments. Bottom line, people are unable to distinguish between true and false confessions. I think that's the bottom line that the article is pointing out. The bottom line for me is that there is a wild gap between college students and actual police investigators, because police investigators are actually doing the work and hold the power. And that is a problem if there's assumptions made about accuracy.
Definitely. And then from the German study that I mentioned at the top under circumstantial differences, they had some other things that they found that I just wanted to put in here under behavioral. So they found that the right to remain silent is waived more often by innocent people than by guilty suspects, which has definitely been corroborated previously in other studies, as well as tons of lab research findings in the literature over the years. And then out of all of their participants who were ever questioned when innocent, a quarter of them reported having made false confessions on at least one occasion. So they noted that this result was also in line with previous international research showing a high percentage of false confessions among suspects with a, quote, mental disorder. Now, I don't know what percentage of their population had any sort of mental disorder or how they were defining that, but I mean, just notable nonetheless.
Yeah, again, it's one of those areas where, I wish they had just gone the extra step and given us that, or written down, notated that information if it was available. But it is what it is. This is what we have to work with right now. So let's turn to focusing primarily on the false confessions. In this article, False Confessions, an integrative review of the phenomenon by Michael Wellner, Matt DeLisi, and Teresa Janiskowski. They provide a well-rounded analysis of false confessions in the criminal justice system, and they examine the psychological, legal, and procedural factors that contribute to individuals admitting to crimes that they did not commit. Guess what? There's not just one type of false confession. Again, this is what I love about research, is that they just break these things down into even more fascinating and complex ideas. So first of all, we have coerced compliant false confessions. And these are confessions that result from intense interrogation tactics where the individual confesses in order to escape the situation. Number two is voluntary false confessions. And that's given without external pressure, often due to a desire for notoriety or for a psychological issue. An example, in 2006, John Mark Carr, a former school teacher, claimed responsibility for the 1996 murder of 6-year-old John Benet Ramsey, asserting that her death was accidental during a sexual encounter. wild contradictions in his account and DNA evidence that didn't match at all the samples that were found at the crime scene, eventually led authorities to dismiss his confession as false.
Yeah, this is totally the one that comes to mind for me. I mean, obviously, with my intense interest in this case, but kind of a hot take after hearing the taped phone calls he made confessing to a journalist. I get it, like it falls under this, but I also think they kind of need to take a look at him again. He had a lot of detail.
Right. I don't disagree with you at all. The intersection here, the Venn diagram, is that, and again, I do not know Mr. Carr. I have not formally evaluated him. But I will say from the information that has been out there for years, for 20 years now, shows that he is an individual with clear mental health challenges. His behaviors are odd. I mean, just there's a whole list we could spend a whole episode just breaking down, his behaviors looked at through a mental health lens. And that's not going back to behavioral analysis and body language like we talk about not approving of. I'm talking about from a clinical perspective.
I just want to say, like, if someone was very intense about fantasizing about this crime, they could definitely come up with a lot of detail. So it doesn't make it true.
But it is fascinating. But that's also what cold reading is about, right? If you understand what the old time sort of carnival attraction of the mentalist who's able to read minds in an audience, that comes from a technique that has been developed for hundreds of years called cold reading an audience. And if you don't know what that concept is, it's fascinating. There's some really great movies about it. Definitely look it up. I think Damnation Alley is one of the most recent ones about it that was a remake. But the other one that has been fascinating for me is another example of voluntary false confessions is Madeleine McCann's disappearance in 2007. I mean, there's a great documentary on it that we both talked about back in the day, but also just how ugly the entire situation was and how, the parents were, everybody was vilified in this. And there have been a lot of claims and confessions, but none of them have been substantiated. So we started off with coerced compliant false confessions. Then we had voluntary false confessions. Now we have internalized false confessions. Complex title, but what it means is that the individual being interrogated actually comes to believe that they committed the crime because of suggestive interrogation techniques. Paul Ingram, a former deputy sheriff in Thurston County, Washington, was accused in 1998 by his daughters of sexual abuse and satanic rituals. Initially, he had no recollection of these events, but under intense interrogation and suggestive questioning, he began to believe he was guilty. Ingram's confessions became increasingly elaborate, incorporating details suggested by interrogators despite a lack of physical evidence. And this is what's really concerning to me, because if an adult can fall prey to this, can you imagine how easily a child can fall prey to this as well?
Well, and it's so interesting, just hearing, first of all, there's been no satanic ritual abuse that have been proven. You guys, I cannot highly recommend enough the podcast Devil in the Deep Blue Sea. Go listen to it. It's fantastic. It covers all of this.
Full disclosure, we have to talk about this too, because we've been called to task by some of our favorite listeners as well. And thank you. I mean, this is one of the things we love about our listeners is how fascinated and educated and interested they are. We found out that some of our colleagues, maybe not colleagues that we've directly worked with, but they are part of a clinical belief system that this type of abuse does exist, despite the fact that there is no evidence, there's no physical evidence whatsoever supporting it.
Yeah, I'll put a link in the show notes to that show, and it's produced by our dear friend, Rebecca Sebastian. So you know her quality of work. It's fantastic. But, thinking in some of the satanic ritual abuse, that it's not just kids that start filling in the information and coming up with false memories, but now here's an example of a suspect, right? An innocent suspect. So this is probably a good time to come back to this term that we mentioned before, memory distrust syndrome. I wanted to parse it out, obviously, because it's called something different from what you just covered, coerced, internalized false confessions. I think they can be one and the same, perhaps, but I just want to kind of, split a couple of hairs here. I also heard this talked about on another podcast very recently as just internalized false confessions. And I feel like if that's more of the umbrella term, then maybe it can be coerced or not. But Good Johnson and Matt Keith coined the term in the 1980s to describe a phenomenon where people developed a profound distrust of their own memory. And then they are in a place where they become susceptible to relying on external cues and information from others, basically putting them in a very highly suggestible place. So the literature indicates that this distrust of memory can, under certain circumstances, lead to a false confession, particularly when there is intense external pressure. They come to believe that they are guilty of the crime, is essentially what that means. And in the psychology world, I mean, we know this already. We know it as confabulation, which is when a person creates false memories without the intention to deceive. So it is just that phenomenon happening, but specifically to false confessions. And if we were to look at it, just let's say outside of the false confession world, clinically seeing confabulation, we would view it as a distortion of the memory. And that's what we're talking about.
And I would be really interested in seeing, as this research continues to develop, the idea of looking at the intersection between those that all prey to memory distress syndrome and have them examined for their lifelong experience of anxiety.
Okay.
Because I would not be surprised if high levels of chronic anxiety are involved in falling prey to this.
So in a really interesting article by Good Johnson in 2017, he presents a case study of a 32-year-old man who falsely confessed to murder while in police custody, awaiting trial. The key elements of the case study examine the impact of essentially his contextual risk factors for confessing falsely. Things like isolation were a factor, long and persistent guilt presumptive interrogation styles, and then high emotional intensity. Those things were all present for this person. So while in solitary confinement, the man kept a detailed diary that provided unique insight into this gradual development of memory distrust syndrome, as well as kind of his overall mental state and overall thinking process. So it's fascinating that Good Johnson was able to find this case. I mean, I'm sure he probably worked on it or was retained on this case or what have you as an expert. But here we have someone writing about it and seeing this evolution or this decompensation, whatever you want to call it. So Good Johnson notes that a false confession as a result of memory distrust syndrome is quite rare, but it can occur in totally intellectually able and educated individuals. Like, this is not just us talking about a serious mentally ill population. He also highlights that when it does occur, it involves delayed rather than immediate suggestibility, which also I couldn't find how he exactly defined that. So I'm not quite sure how to interpret that.
I think it has to do with anxiety.
Tell me more about that. Like, what do you mean? What are you thinking?
You know, people with very high levels of anxiety tend to ruminate and perseverate. So what if we're talking about in the immediacy of the interrogation, they're very clear, no, I did not do this. But then in the isolation of their cell or the isolation of their life, if they, you know, have been brought in multiple times, maybe they don't have a support system and they sit there and they're just marinating in anxiety and they're ruminating. And there's so many neurochemicals that are shooting through your brain when you're having a panic attack or a series of anxiety attacks. I'm wondering if you're reprogramming your own memories by marinating in this false information you've been given. And I just feel like you're marinating in the anxiety and you're trying to make sense of it. And the easiest way to make sense of it is maybe to accept what's being said to you.
That's an incredibly interesting hypothesis. I think maybe we need to dig a little deeper just to see if there are any studies
again,
that,
folks, don't, this is just me off the top of my head based on what the research we've done for this. But as somebody who's lived with anxiety, like, we joke about it. Like, I'm one of those people that when I'm walking out of Costco is like, did I just steal a 52-inch television set and I've got it in my backpack and I wasn't thinking about it? I don't want to get in trouble. right?
Oh, I know. Well, but not just like your experiences, but because of your experiences and wanting to help others in these same situations, you've
Right.
done a great deal of research. So, overall, though, I just want to let people know that yes, this is a phenomenon accepted by the wider psychological community, meaning memory distrust syndrome. We're also like very suspect of syndromes around here, as you guys know.
Yeah.
We question a lot of things that get slapped with that label. So I thought it was really worth the effort just to say, like, yes, this is a real thing and here's what it means. And I think it's going to click for a lot of folks of like, oh my gosh, yeah, that case really could have been this. And it also leads nicely into looking at some of the personal individual factors that might make someone susceptible to falsely confessing.
So there are a lot of factors that end up being components that would make an individual more vulnerable to this. If we acknowledge that there are circumstances where investigators seek evidence that supports guilt and thereby will ignore contradictory evidence of non-guilt, that in combination with individual vulnerabilities can lead to huge problems. And when we talk about false confessions, it's so important to understand that not everybody enters the interrogation room on equal footing, much like life, right? Even more so in the interrogation room. Some individuals are far more vulnerable to pressure, suggestion, and manipulation, just like we've discussed in previous episodes, as well as our interviews with other true crime content generators. First and foremost, young people are especially at risk. Adolescents and children may not fully grasp the gravity of waiving their Miranda rights or the long-term consequences of what they say to law enforcement. And, law enforcement has the legal right to present falsehoods in order to get what they need to do. So while a child, certainly a child that is a minor, all of that should be shut down. I mean, they can interview, but they should be really shutting that down unless they have permission from parents, and parents should actually be calling attorneys immediately. But, law enforcement's going to do what they got to do from their perspective in order to get the information that they get. But children's developmental stage makes them more likely to comply with authority figures, even if that means saying something that is just not true, because they want to end the discomfort or maybe even please the interrogator, right? Many kids don't yet have the emotional or cognitive maturity to understand just how high the stakes are, let alone be able to endure intense psychological tactics that are often used in modern interrogations. So being open to suggestibility, the length of the interview, the belief in, well, if you work with us, you can just walk out of here, which is an
Classic.
example of a deceptive high pressure technique, right? So there's also another factor, which is a little bit more conceptual, but it's this idea of this naive belief in innocence. So innocent individuals, people who are actually innocent, may waive their rights because they believe I've got nothing to hide, which unfortunately paradoxically increases the risk of false confessions. And this applies to those with cognitive impairments as well. So then back to what we were referring to earlier, there is the issue of mental health. Individuals struggling with disorders like schizophrenia, major depression, bipolar disorder, they often enter the legal system already at a disadvantage. Their symptoms, which can include a wide spectrum of presentations that would include things like delusions, which is, incorrect beliefs or perceptions about the world around them, disorganized thinking, severe anxiety, suicidal ideation. All of those factors can distort reality and impair judgment, making those individuals much more susceptible to coercion. And in some cases, they may even confess to something that they didn't do simply to escape the moment or because they believe that they deserve punishment after having this belief system, these false facts sort of pounded into their heads. It is important to differentiate those with cognitive impairments or developmental disabilities away from or differentiate them from people with mental health diagnoses, because cognitive impairments are not mental health diagnoses. People with lower IQs, limited executive functioning, or challenges in processing information can fail to understand their rights or the implications of their statements. They may not realize that they can remain silent or ask for a lawyer. And in high pressure situations, They might give in just to escape the confusion, the pressure, their perceived threat. And these individuals' ability to distinguish truth from suggestion or resist leading questions is significantly compromised.
Yes. All right. So let's move into talking about the interrogation process, how that has certainly evolved over time, and where is it going in the future? Because obviously, this is still a problem. False confessions often stem not from threats or force, not anymore anyway, but from psychologically coercive interrogation tactics that continue to be used in various investigation entities around the world. One major factor, as we talked about already, is isolation. When suspects are left alone for long periods of time, their stress increases and they become more likely to comply just to escape the discomfort, or maybe even with your hypothesis, Scott, the discomfort in their head due to anxiety. Add to that the use of deceptive practices like falsely claiming there's evidence or promising leniency, and you have a recipe for guilty and innocent people alike confessing, again, just to kind of end the pressure. We also have lengthy interrogations, often lasting hours without proper breaks. This can also wear people down mentally and physically. Fatigue impairs judgment, you guys, like you wouldn't believe. I mean, insomnia, lack of sleep is just so critical in terms of your cognitive functioning. This makes individuals way more suggestible and more likely to say what they think interrogators want to hear. Estimating the true number of false confessions really remains difficult due to underreporting and limited access to comprehensive data. And while not every false confession is identified or overturned, research consistently shows that they play a significant role in wrongful convictions at large, as we talked about those numbers earlier. Although the exact figures vary by study, the consensus is clear: false confessions are not rare, and their impact on the justice system is significant and does not obtain the attention that it needs.
So, this phenomenon of confessions, both true and false, and the interrogations that generate them really present a very complex interplay of psychological, legal, and neuroscientific factors. Thankfully, the recent emphasis on legitimate, statistically viable research has illuminated and just really brought to the surface how certain interrogation techniques can lead to false confessions by way of cognitive and neural mechanisms that underlie these confessions. And that is a lot of implication that pans out for the justice system. Let's begin by looking at the evolution of interrogation techniques. Historically, police have used coercive tactics, what was once called the third degree, right? These tactics included physical violence and psychological manipulation, and that was all designed to elicit confessions. It wasn't designed to get the truth. It was designed to elicit confessions. But by the 1960s, most of these techniques were largely replaced by accusatorial methods that focused on psychological manipulation in order to obtain confessions. So yes, it was a change of direction, but it wasn't enough. And it certainly wasn't wildly different what was being done before, right?
The same goal, basically. They just did it a different way.
Exactly. It was the same goal with very little understanding of everything that we've laid out in our foundation so far. And these accusatorial approaches became standard not just in the US, but also in countries like Canada and the UK. So, what does accusatorial interrogation look like? Well, again, it assumes guilt and it is confession driven. And it involves 6 key points: interrogator dominance and control, stress inducing isolation of the suspect, use of themes to rationalize guilt, like telling the individual, well, you had no choice. It involves deceptive tactics such as false evidence, which is allowed because police can lie to you basically during interrogation, and techniques like maximization, which is exaggerating the consequences and then minimizing as well, downplaying the seriousness. So accusatorial techniques also rely heavily on detecting anxiety-based nonverbal cues to determine deception. And what does that sound like, Dr. Shiloh?
Bullshit.
Bullshit. It sounds like body analysis, right? Or
Yeah.
behavioral analysis, but
Body
body language
language
experts,
analysis.
right?
Yeah.
And despite the best training, look, not all interrogators are capable of detecting, discerning, and processing this type of information. That's my personal and my clinical perspective. You can learn a technique, and we're going to talk about the actual names of the techniques that exist. But just because you learn a technique does not mean that you are utilizing it correctly, and it doesn't mean that you are interpreting the results correctly. So all of these tactics up to this point really increased both true and false confessions.
Right. So these methods, like the famous or infamous Reed technique, still rely heavily on psychological pressure, deception, and confirmation bias, or what they literally call psychological warfare in their manual. The Reed technique assumes guilt from the outset. Tactics include prolonged isolation, false evidence ploys, like you mentioned, and minimization and maximization strategies. The research by Casson, Meisner, and Good-Johnson have shown that while these methods do result in true confessions, they also greatly increase the risk of false ones, especially among the young, cognitively impaired, and emotionally vulnerable. Other factors that can come into play with some of these cases are, as we mentioned, sleep deprivation. Huge sleep deprived individuals are more susceptible to suggestion and may falsely confess to actions that they didn't commit. High cognitive load. We haven't talked about this concept yet necessarily today, but under significant mental strain, individuals may experience impaired memory and decision making, increasing that risk of falsely confessing. Now, contrast this with the Mendez principles, a new gold standard grounded in empirical research. These principles advocate for rapport-based interviewing, active listening, transparency, and the ethical collection of information. Instead of trying to break down a suspect, interviewers are trained to build trust and then obtain reliable facts. Such approaches aim to gather accurate and reliable information while also respecting human rights.
What a concept. So let's turn to real world applications of this. Authors Usha Sutliff and Mark Severino from Auburn University in Alabama, they tell the story of how the LA Police Department started using science-backed interviewing techniques and these methods that changed the way they solve cases in the way that they talk to suspects. The shift started with a high-profile murder mystery that really feels straight out of a Hollywood thriller. So in 2012, the dismembered body of Hervey Medellin, a flight attendant, was found near the Hollywood sign. The LAPD suggested Medellin's partner, Gabriel Campos Martinez, but they had no solid evidence. The case went cold until two LAPD detectives, Greg Stearns and Tim Marcia, tried something new. They used the techniques that were developed by the FBI's High-Value Detainee Interrogation Group, or known as HIG, which were originally designed to ethically question terrorism suspects without using coercion. So, in science-based interviewing, like the Haig technique, they focused on careful preparation before the interview, create a calm, respectful atmosphere, ask open-ended questions to encourage detailed memories, listening more than talking, right? And then focusing on what people say, not just their body language. You know, if you just listen to people, they'll tell you everything.
It's amazing. Trust us.
I'm telling you, as a clinician and as somebody that in my former role with law enforcement, I watched so many interrogation tapes, like just hours and hours and hours. And the most successful ones were not being coercive. They were just letting them talk and gently guiding the conversation. This technique is really in high contrast with some of the cases that we mentioned earlier, like the Central Park Five, or the case of Brendan Dassey from Making a Murderer, where minors were subjected to hours-long interrogations without counsel, and then they confessed falsely under enormous psychological stress. So these are examples that demonstrate the danger of using outdated techniques versus the promise of reform.
Then we have a very infamous case, the Guildford 4 case, which is an example of the most significant errors of justice in British legal history. In 1975, Jerry Conlon, Paul Hill, Patty Armstrong, and Carol Richardson were wrongfully convicted for the 1974 IRA bombings of 2 pubs in Guildford, Surrey, which resulted in 5 deaths and numerous injuries. The convictions were primarily based on confessions obtained under highly stressful interviews, with the accused subjected to intense interrogation tactics, including physical abuse and threats against family members. In spite of the Balcombe Street IRA unit confessing to the bombings in 1975, the Guildford Four remained incarcerated for 15 years. Their convictions were finally quashed in 1989 after it was revealed that the police had manipulated interview notes and suppressed exculpatory evidence. The case continues to be extensively analyzed in academic and media circles over the past decades. The article, The Trial of the Guildford Four, Government Error or Government Persecution, published in the Journal of Law and Society, lays out the political and legal failures that led to this specific wrongful conviction. Additionally, the BBC has reported on the continued scrutiny of the case, including the sealing of the related documents by the Home Office. This case prompted movement in Europe to explore and implement significant changes. Most significantly, it led to the development of the PEACE model, PEACE, which is used in the UK, Wales, Australia, and now prioritizes information gathering over confession and employs tasks such as, again, rapport building, evidence presentation, strategic questioning, all of this while emphasizing ethical and effective investigative interviewing.
Detectives who used the new techniques like HIG in the LAPD case found overall they got better results. Studies have shown that the victims and the suspects gave more detailed information. They were able to clear more cases and even in some cases exonerate innocent suspects, which we really like. And they built stronger rapport, which then helped break down resistance. Detective and instructor Nanette Tewsbury, a leader in the LAPD's training efforts before retiring, said that she saw clear improvements. By using techniques like tell, explain, and describe, or TED for short, officers got richer and more profound stories, and then they could cross-check details way more effectively. She also emphasized the importance of listening, showing interest, and being respectful, even to difficult suspects. This is so important to emphasize. Listen, be open, get information, take it all down, rather than creating this level of conflict and level of anxiety, which is not going to contribute to your intended goal, right? So Tewsbury revised the LAPD's curriculum to move away from relying on gut feelings or interpreting body language and instead to focus on what people actually say. She argued that showing empathy and respect often leads suspects to open up more than intimidation ever could.
So according to Sutliff and Severino, in the article that we were referencing earlier, the biggest benefits of science-based techniques include looking for signs of truth, not just signs of lying, building rapport to reduce resistance, learning about future threats or intentions, so not just being in the here and now, but kind of exploring some of this conversation as to future intentions, tapping into academic research and real-time feedback from experts, and then improving memory recall and the accuracy of the information through a number of different techniques that can be done as well.
So retired military interrogator Steve Kleinman, he is a critic of the older, harsher techniques, and he emphasizes that using the newer techniques is not about a one-size-fits-all checklist. It's about using data to understand what works and what doesn't work in interviews, and that each interaction should be grounded in science, not guesswork. Already a fan of Mr. Kleinman, clearly. He goes on to warn that false confessions damage not just the individuals that are in the room, but really entire communities. And which makes so much sense, because when you do that, the word is going to get out, just that there's going to be distrust. And that is what causes rifts between people whose duty is to protect the community they're in, right? So science-based methods protect civil rights and they build trust in law enforcement. Now, the truth is, despite success stories, changing police culture is challenging at best. Officers often believe that they already know how to talk to people, not because they haven't been trained or encouraged to try different techniques, but because they are out in the street and they may be partnered with someone who is not getting some of the more advanced, newer. They're like somebody that's kind of grizzled, older, they're used to doing it their way. And then the person who's with them is heavily influenced by that. And that's only one factor. There can be tons of other factors as well, right? Others see that rapport building is sometimes too soft or time consuming. Like, this just takes too long. We need to like get in there and yell at them and wave our fingers, right? And then, of course, especially in today's discourse, some fear that this is just political correctness in disguise. And look, I get it. I get that you can have that perspective. That's why we fall back on data, seeing that it actually is what's working, and it's what's working better than what we were doing before.
Yeah, definitely. And I will say, being a cop, being a street cop, a patrol cop, you get so much face time with just people from all walks of life and in so many different situations in their life that, the average person doesn't come into contact with. People in these horrible moments of tragedy,
right,
or even like wonderful, beautiful moments, that it does give you a ton of experience, unlike any other, of being able to talk to people. I mean, I know I definitely learned my gift of gab there. And I probably have said this before, being a 5'5" female, I had to use my words a lot, especially to de-escalate situations, because I knew I wasn't going to be able to necessarily like fight it out. Not that I wanted any situation to get to that, but I was hyper aware of it. And I think that also sort of spilled over into my clinical work. And initially, for all those years working with parolees and probationers in a clinical setting, that, as we're going through all this, I'm like, gosh, yeah, cops can kind of talk to anyone. I will give them that. When you're interviewing and interrogating, it's different, right? In this setting in which you are trying to come to a determination of prosecution. Because if you're a cop on the street, you're just trying to grab enough evidence, probable cause to maybe take somebody to jail. Being a detective and kind of going down the road as an investigating officer is much more serious and different. And these are the times that, if I had just unlimited amount of years in my life, that I wish I had stayed in law enforcement longer, because as I kind of looked at like what's next in my career, I was starting to say, you know what, I really want to study interview and interrogation, because I want to be really badass at this. That was just sort of a thought, like a goal in the next few years for me. But of course, I ended up taking the psychological route instead. But it would have been interesting, I think, back on that Shiloh, and what would she have learned? Like, what was out there in 2008, 2009, and how has that changed? So this is a very reflective episode for a lot of ways for me, but, just talking about letting people talk and sitting there and being empathetic. I mean, you and I worked with some very difficult clients. I know we were clinicians, not cops interrogating them, but we're still trying to get them to tell us the truth about some really awful, shameful things that they had done.
Well, and look, there's also the sort of the parallel process between what we're talking about in these interview techniques and clinical work, is that there are some clinicians that follow an orientation of unconditional positive regard. And there is a place for that. If someone comes from a completely invalidating household, and, to find a therapist that just does nothing but build them up and help them rebuild a foundation of self-esteem, I get that. I'm all for that. In certain situations, at certain times, with certain individuals, there are so many circumstances that play a part in that. The work that I do clinically, many times I'm working with and I know this is a broad reach, but I work with people that are in entertainment, which is where I used to work. And I have to be very, very forward with some people about, look, this is the reality of the business. So, the reality is, this is what the economy is, this is what the business is, and you are an artist. But the reality is, you've been telling me this. Well, I've been listening to you for a long time now, and you've told me this, this, and this, but you are acting in ways that are contradictory to what you have told me. But I wouldn't have been able to gently pull apart that statement unless I had been listening really thoroughly for the last 6 months, right? To go, I hear you saying this, but I also see you doing this. And there's a parallel to what is happening in these interrogation techniques, is if you listen long enough, you will be able to say, well, I thank you for this information. what you said before was this. So help me understand what your perspective was then versus right now. And just being non-confrontational and being curious is going to show a lot of deception more than yelling at somebody, right? When somebody
Yeah,
can't keep their story straight, just
for
think of
sure.
all that information you've collected about it. I do think it's fascinating. I love your idea, that sort of sliding doors perspective of what if. I don't want
Yeah.
ever anybody to ever go back and like be regretful of decisions that you made or did not make, because ultimately we are where we are.
Oh
I have
yeah,
those
I'm
about
not
like,
regretting
wow,
anything.
I know. And knowing what we know
Definitely.
now, like, oh, wow, to use this, all of this stuff that we've learned over the past 2 decades, that would
Yeah,
be fascinating.
yeah, for sure. But when we
Yeah.
talk about changing police culture, the key really is in showing results, not just kind of explaining the science.
Yes.
Case by case, the evidence, shows these methods work, and then letting that be involved in trainings, and then like having these detectives, like the ones that we're talking about at LAPD, show like, oh my gosh, look at what we got in this case that was essentially cold for so long. So Sutliff and Severino recommend a few things. They say expand access to training in science-based methods. So I know this is definitely happening. There's a whole society now, or an association for evidence-based research in policing and evidence-based training in policing. So this movement is definitely happening. And then framing these new techniques as additions, maybe not replacements just yet, but adding the good stuff to your plate, like the broccoli, instead of taking away all the bad for you stuff that tastes really good so
The
far. And
sausage gravy.
yeah, that old like dietitian trick, like just add the good stuff and then we'll take that away from you. Also, they suggest creating opportunities for cops nationwide to learn from each other, right? So if you have people that have done this successfully, then they go out and do the training. That makes for way more buy-in than some researcher or doctor getting up there and saying like, hey, you should try this. Lastly, they suggest making sure science-based techniques are explained in operational terms that cops can use, right? You just, like any training or course, you have to learn the language of your audience and use that so it will be received well. Other experts have also chimed in, like Dr. Joanna Author and Dr. Debbie Frankfurt, who have led Higgs research efforts. They say the LAPD partnership helped create a feedback loop between cops and scientists, which is also awesome. They see it as a model for how research and practice can work together. When science-backed interviews start solving cases and protecting rights, that's when the rest of the country will take notice.
So, how do we create this sustainable change? First of all, it's got to be through comprehensive science-based training. And these Mendez principles that we've discussed over the last few minutes propose institutional training that emphasizes rapport building, active listening, and legal rights education. What a concept, right? Role playing, realistic scenarios, and video feedback are all essential. I think that's so important. Like, watch
Yeah.
yourself, understand what you, as the interrogator, are doing with your body language. Like, are you being intimidating when you should be just kind of creating this calm environment for the person that you're having this talk with? And secondly, and maybe just as importantly, we need cultural change. Steve Kleinman, that we noted earlier, he says that law enforcement has traditionally prized confession-driven methods, but modern policing just has to shift towards truth-seeking rather than confession-seeking. Those two things can work together, but they're also problematic if the confession-driven part takes too much emphasis, right?
Sure.
So this cultural shift only happens when officers see that these new techniques will work in practice. And he says, you got to show it, don't just say it.
Yeah. And I think, with all of this, Scott and I, at a bare minimum, feel that this comes down to three major implementations. This is not like our original thoughts. This is just what we kind of hone in on. Adopt the ethical interviewing techniques, which is going to reduce the incidence of false confessions via some sort of policy reform, right?
Yeah.
Like it just has to be implemented. It can't be, let's talk about it. Just the research is there, start using it, make policy for it. Second, a legal standard that makes mandatory recording of interrogations and ensuring legal access to counsel can protect individuals' rights. That's going to be vital. So again, there is no mandatory recording of interrogations. I'll leave it there. I mean, I think there's some pros and cons to how that plays out in court and to jurors.
Right.
But what it does is we're just in this sort of like little box that we're talking about here, it makes interviewers accountable. Lastly, training and education for law enforcement personnel on these tactics, as well as the psychological and maybe even the neuroscientific aspects to interrogations, we think will go a long way in preventing coercive practices. If they know that those techniques can cause these outcomes just because of that's the way the brain works, or that's because a thing like memory distrust syndrome actually exists, it's going to give them some pause of like, oh my gosh, okay, I didn't, this wasn't my intention. And now the science is saying, here's what it could lead to. We think that would be really instrumental. So normally at this point, we kind of transition into a criminal case or two that has the phenomena we've talked about. We've covered a few in passing through this episode today already. And then in other episodes, I mean, Amanda Knox just came to my mind over and over again as we were formulating this episode and writing it out. So instead of covering another one, we just leave this question to you guys. What false confession case has made the biggest impact on you? Let us know through social media, posting on this episode, email us, tag us, pop it in the comments on Patreon, whatever, wherever. I feel like we all kind of have that one that is stuck out to us for various reasons. And, the reason for doing this episode and episodes like this is to encourage the research fields, hopefully to keep doing good work, to then inform policy and procedure so that this stops happening. I mean, we're not too big for our britches. We know our part is really small here, but please support content creators who are bringing attention to these devastating impacts of false confessions and wrongful convictions. There are really amazing people out there doing great work. And the more you give that attention, even if it's just in one case that gets more attention on it, or if it's something like this, like talking about the science and police training, that's it. If you feel like you can't do anything, sometimes that's the little part that you can play as well.
There are some really great entertainment examples. There's a scripted depiction of a real life event that we touched on, In the Name of the Father from 1993, a really well-constructed, powerful drama that is based on that story of the Guildford Four, which was a group of Irishmen wrongly convicted of an IRA bombing in England in the 1970s. And of course, Daniel Day-Lewis plays the lead, Jerry Conlon. The show follows his being coerced into confessing into the crime and then being sentenced to life in prison. Not only that, but his father, Giuseppe Conlon, is also imprisoned as part of the alleged conspiracy. And then while in prison, he begins to fight for justice and to clear their names, aided by a determined lawyer played by Emma Thompson, who is never bad. She's always great. And this film very, very succinctly explores themes of injustice, family, and perseverance. And it was nominated for 7 Academy Awards. Daniel Day-Lewis is an intense actor. And of course, this is one of his intense roles. It's really, really good.
Yes. Then if you want more of a docuseries to focus on this topic, Netflix, of course, Netflix always coming through. They have the confession tapes. So this series investigates cases where people convicted of murder claim that their confessions were either coerced, false, or involuntary. So you get to watch the recordings of these as they explore those cases. Also, I just want to put in here recommended listening. So Truth and Justice with Bob Ruff, we already mentioned. He just put out an episode called The Science of False Confessions. Very serendipitous. Again, like you said, Scott, this was all kind of weaving together. But he speaks with a false confessions expert, Alan Hirsch, who has his own podcast called The Truth About False Confessions, that he has done a number of episodes on looking at cases. He's not currently doing any more episodes, but it sounds really interesting if you want more content. So we'll put links to all of that, as well as all the commentary that we've done pretty recently in the show notes. We'll put them in the show notes. And then, of course, on our website, you guys can always go to our Spotlight tab. And that has every single guest, YouTube, podcast, written article, all the above. We have cataloged those for you if you just want to see where else we have kind of been yapping our mouths.
Yeah. Our next Behind the Couch is going to be scheduled for Saturday, June 21st. We're going to be talking with retired FBI agent Kate Schweit about her new book, Women Who Talk to the Dead. We love Kate. We've talked to her before. Please, please, please tune in. She's always an absolutely fascinating guest. Again, we want to thank all of our Patreon members for their support, their patronage. We've been having a blast doing our sort of off the cuff shrink wraps that are available to our Patreon members. We have not released those to the general public. We kind of like to keep it as a special little bonus. So, if you're up for some extra listening, you can always join for a month and just knock yourself out on all the additional content we've created and then take a break. It's not a long commitment, but check us out. We have a lot of fun with those. And we will see you next time on LA
Not So
Confidential. Bye, folks.
Bye, guys. Take care. We sincerely thank you for spending some time with us today. LA Not So Confidential is part of Alienist Entertainment and the Crawl Space Media Network. Each episode is hosted, produced, and written by Dr. Scott and Dr. Shiloh. Our post-production editing and sweetening magic is handled by the multi-talented Jason Usry of Ear Cult Productions.
Our theme music, entitled Cool Vibes Film Noir, is composed and performed by the talented Kevin MacLeod. He graciously allows us to use his music via a Creative Commons attribution license. Please check out all of Kevin's amazing work on YouTube.
All of the resources for each episode can be found on our website at www.la-not-so-confidential.com. You can find us on Blue Sky and Instagram at LA Not So Podcast. On TikTok, Facebook, and YouTube, we are at LA Not So Confidential. Media inquiries and bookings are scheduled at alienistentertainment@gmail.com.
Once a month, we go live on YouTube on a Saturday afternoon. So stay tuned to our social media announcements to join our interactive broadcast entitled Behind the Couch, where we interview guests on a number of psych, criminal justice, and true crime topics.
And lastly, we'd be honored if you joined our Patreon at patreon.com/LA Not So Podcast. With a subscription, you get an ad-free listening experience, additional content, host interaction, and you'll be the first to know about upcoming live events, social gatherings, and super cool merch.
So thanks for listening, and join us next time on LA
Not So
Confidential.